Dear Professor Rowe, dear colleagues, dear students, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the third lecture of the 2024-25 edition of the annual research seminar, The Worlds of History, New Perspectives and Debates, sponsored by the Center for the History of Society and Culture of the University of Coimbra. The main purpose of this seminar, as some of you know, is to stimulate the dialogue with the leading historians, with their cutting-edge research, methodologies, and new problematics, with a particular emphasis on global and imperial history. Our guest today is Erin Rowe. Currently, she is full professor at the Department of History of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore and Vice Dean for Undergraduate Education in the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. Professor Rowe, I would like to express my sincere gratitude for your attendance in Coimbra. Drawing from my own personal experience, I am very aware that professors who hold institutional positions within the university often encounter significant challenges and find themselves with limited availability for scientific activities. Professor Rowe obtained her PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 2005, and she commenced her academic career as an assistant professor at the University of Oregon in 2006. She subsequently transferred to the University of Virginia, and since 2012 to Johns Hopkins, where she is now. As a historian, she defined herself as someone who explores the religious culture of the early modern Iberian world, with particular emphasis on theology, race, gender, and visual culture, with a special focus in the complex histories of devotions to saints. Her interests also extend to global history, transnational history, and Atlantic history. The book she edited with Kimberly Lin, titled The Early Modern Hispanic World, Transnational and Interdisciplinary Approaches, published by Cambridge University Press in 2017, is a very good expression of these interests. In another of her books, she even proposed a very interesting definition, in my point of view, for global Catholicism by stating that, and I quote, "It is less about the dispersion of specific geographies than about its analytical potential. It provides a method for analyzing the processes of religious transformation that occurred throughout the early modern Catholic Church as it began to spread around the globe. It urges us to displace the centrality of Europeans to the global Christianization that unfolded throughout the early modern world." End of quote. Professor Rowe has published extensively in a number of esteemed journals, including the Catholic Historical Review, 16th Century Journal, and the American Historical Review, this last one widely regarded as one of the most prestigious history journals in the Anglo-Saxon world. In this journal, she published the article, "After Death, Her Face Turned White: Blackness, Whiteness, and Sanctity in the Early Modern Hispanic World," in which she revealed the fascinating case study of Teresa Juliana. Teresa was a woman from Guinea who was abducted as a child and sold into slavery. She subsequently died in Spain, in the convent of Santa Maria Magdalena, also known as La Penitencia in Salamanca, where she was reputed to possess marks of sanctity. Erin Rowe's research in this journal article can be considered an expression of her interest in the agency of subaltern actors, seeking to give voice to those who have historically been overlooked by historians. An excellent example of this tendency, also in the United States, is James Sweet's book, Domingos Álvares, that you also know very well, African Healing and the Intellectual History of the Atlantic World. Domingos, in a certain way, was a figure similar to Teresa. Domingos was an enslaved person coming from Dahomey, in the west coast of Africa, who resided in Brazil and later in Lisbon. And he was convicted by the Portuguese Inquisition in the later half of the 17th century, accused of sorcery and healing. In 2023, as a noteworthy illustration of Professor Rowe's research interests in visual culture, she contributed with a chapter titled Creating Black Catholics to the catalogue of an exceptional exhibition held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, entitled Juan de Pareja, Afro-Hispanic Painter in the Age of Velázquez. Professor Rowe has also authored several significant books, including Saint and Nation, Santiago, Teresa of Avila, and Plural Identities in Early Modern Spain, published in 2011 by Pennsylvania State University. In this book, she provides a comprehensive analysis of the political and religious discourse that transpired between 1612 and 1630 throughout the Hispanic world concerning the designation of Spain's patron saint, Santiago or Teresa de Avila. There was a big dispute among these. Professor Rowe's most recent book, Black Saints in Early Modern Global Catholicism, published in 2019 by Cambridge University Press, is a significant contribution to the study of global Christianity. It was awarded the Roland Baton Prize by 16th Century Studies in 2020 and the Albert Hautler Prize by the American Society of Church History. Professor Rowe was also awarded a year-long fellowship at the prestigious Institute for Advanced Studies in the University of Princeton while preparing this book, and this prestigious award is well deserved given the book's outstanding quality. This book, which is richly illustrated, is the result of careful research in Roman, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Peruvian archives, together with a vast array of printed sources. It is also noteworthy for what I believe to be the most extensive collection of paintings and sculptures depicting black saints, primarily from Spain and Portugal, and especially Portugal. Erin Rowe has demonstrated, with a remarkable degree of analytical sophistication, the profound impact of Afro-Iberians on Catholic belief and practice. As she asserts, and I quote her, the veneration of black saints represented more than a spiritual presence. It constituted an act of creativity that effectively resisted white hegemony, profoundly transformed the church, and refused to remain unseen. End of quote. According to Simon Ditchfeld, one of the historians that gave a lecture here also 3 or 4 years ago, according to Simon Ditchfeld, who has best studied the spread of Catholicism during the early modern period, this book is essential reading to understand how sacred blackness was constructed and circulated in a transatlantic world. Finally, I should note that Erin Rowe is an excellent connoisseur of Sir John Eliot's masterly work. She has published very important reviews of his books, particularly in the Journal of Early Modern History. And I would like to take this opportunity to emphasize to this audience of young apprentices of historians the importance of the critical review which Erin Rowe practices frequently also. Professor Rowe, we are delighted for having you here with us today at the University of Coimbra, and we are very much looking forward to hearing you. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. I will stay here because of the PowerPoint.
Is there...
Temos aí o problema do PowerPoint. Eu tenho que pôr ali e depois it is a little bit far for you.
Okay. Should I stand next to you?
No, you can stay there. Depois eu esqueci-me de trazer o coisinho de mudar. Well, you don't have too many slides. So
No.
when you need, you go there and you pick
Okay.
it, if you don't mind.
No, I don't.
Okay?
Thank you very much for the invitation. It is a great honor to be here and to talk to you about this project that I'm working on. I am actually going to start this story again with Teresa Juliana, because the hagiography of her is so rich and set me asking different kinds of questions than I had in my book. And one of the things that I was thinking through is, what is the relationship between the way the Spanish, particularly the clergy, thought about and talked about the two slaving systems, the Mediterranean and the transatlantic. And we often don't talk about those together, but my thesis is that it is imperative that we talk about them together, because especially in Spain and also here in Portugal, there were communities from both, there were enslaved communities of both groups, both kind of North African, often referred to as Turkish, and also West and Central African, living in communities side by side. But the Spanish in particular talked about those communities in very different ways. So this paper represents the beginning of that conversation, but I will say that what I'm going to talk about today is mostly from printed work and not the archives, and so it is much less about the lived experience of enslaved people in communities, and that part of that social history of the way that people interacted with each other is something that I plan on looking into next. But here is just my first thoughts of thinking about how these systems worked together. In a discursive way, because that was really powerful. That was a very powerful way that Spaniards had to kind of think through the justification of different slaving systems, and because they were very aware from a legal, canon law, and theological perspective that they needed to justify the systems of slaving. It was not, no matter what they said, they knew that there needed to be a justification, an explanation for what they were doing, for making it right, making it legal, in fact. And so they're articulating all the time why it's okay. And they say for different reasons, the different groups. And that gives us a window into the way they're thinking about the two systems. But the two systems also coexist. They happen at the same time, of course. They happen in the same spaces. And this is really important. One of the interesting things, and I'll just say this as a side note, about North African slavery in Spain that's very interesting is that, we're all familiar with the expulsion of the Moriscos at the beginning of the 17th century. And we have this idea that that means that all people of North African Islamic descent were forcibly converted to Christianity and then expelled. And then somehow there are no more people who are Muslim in Spain after this point. But that is not the case. There were lots of enslaved people who were Turkish, mostly from North Africa, who were living in Spain throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries, largely unconverted. And it is this difference between West and Central Africans who were forcibly converted to Christianity, almost without exception, and the Turkish North African slaves that were largely left unbaptized. That is particularly interesting to me. So, In 1689 Madrid, the royal family and courtiers observed a lavish festival celebrating the translation of a famous sculpture of Jesus Nazareno to a new chapel built to house it. The image, depicting Christ wearing a crown of thorns, hands bound, on the way to his crucifixion, was of particular significance in early modern Spanish devotions because it had been rescued after being seized by Moroccan Muslims as they conquered the city of Marwa, North Africa, which had been a Spanish presidio. Redeemed by the Descalced Trinitarians in 1682 and brought to Madrid from Sevilla, its redemption and return to the capital city symbolized the triumph of Christianity over enemies both spiritual and terrestrial. As with many important festivals, artists produced black and white engravings sold as single sheets for widespread distribution at prices that many could afford.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. These, there.
It's also do some physical exercise.
Yes. And actually the next one is very soon after, so I'll be jumping up again in just a second. But here is an example of a 17th century engraving sheet of this particular image. And one of the things, I'll just show you the next one right now. The Jesus Nazareno is also known as the Cristo de Medina Celi, and it is still a very important image in Madrid, and there are special days when people come to venerate it, and they are allowed behind the altar to kiss its feet. And it is very common for people to walk in on their knees and go up the stairs and kiss his feet. It's also taken out on procession, and here he is in real life. Among the members of nobility present at the occasion, and owner of one of these engravings, was the Marquess of Mencera, a powerful grandee and former viceroy of New Spain. One of the engravings in his household made its way into the hands of an enslaved servant, Teresa, who had been kidnapped in West Africa and brought to Madrid, where she was gifted to the Marquess by Charles II. A devout child, she immediately became intensely devoted to this specific image of Christ in his double suffering. That is, Christ on the way to his death, already having been beaten and humiliated, and Christ, the image itself, beaten and humiliated in the Moroccan streets. Here, an enslaved and mistreated West African child saw herself bound up in Christ as suffering captive, both of them redeemed through Spanish Catholicism. This vignette, to which I will return below, calls our attention to the multiple modalities of enslavement that coexisted in early modern Spain. I see the collision of the two as key to understanding the history of enslavement in early modern Spain and to the ways in which Spaniards thought about and understood the morality and legality of slavery itself. Triangular entanglements took place within Spain, not only outside of it, and they generated a framework for the ways that Spaniards categorized, understood, and created visions of empire and humanity. And I will add here another parenthetical, which is there are other iterations of slave trades that existed that required distinct modes of meditation on morality and legality. And the most obvious one is the enslavement of indigenous peoples in Americas, which was outlawed in the 16th century, although it persisted after it was outlawed. And that required a different way for jurists to articulate when that was allowed, and then later why it was not allowed. Much important scholarship has emerged and continues to emerge, dedicated to investigating the political, economic, diplomatic, and intellectual aspects of the early modern Western Mediterranean. Scholars have examined Spanish slave markets from the late Middle Ages to the 18th century through the lens of social history that accounted for the simultaneous prevalence of enslaved people from North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and West Central Africa. Much scholarship has been written about both the transatlantic slave trade and the Mediterranean slave trade, but it is a truism to point out that they overlapped from 1500 to 1750 in particular. Arturo Morgado Garcia helpfully describes these systems as distinct models of enslavement, and his own scholarship examines both in the context of early modern Cádiz, the main Atlantic port of the Spanish kingdoms beginning in the mid-17th century, displacing Sevilla. Yet the scholarship overall has a tendency to treat the two models separately. When discussed together, it is generally within a framework that sees the influence of the Mediterranean on the Atlantic. Here. Okay. One important exception is the work of Gillian Weiss, who has analyzed the entangled relationship of Mediterranean and Atlantic slavery in the imaginations of 18th century France. She argues that thinking about, quote, diverse forms of servitude, the Atlantic and Mediterranean, uncovers a shift in French ideas of freedom and unfreedom over time and provides a fresh outlook on the intersection between Mediterranean and Atlantic slaveries. This type of work is crucial for thinking with freedom and unfreedom. Spanish cities such as Sevilla and Barcelona maintained sizable populations of multi-ethnic and multi-religious enslaved people who shared parishes, streets, markets, and households as they worked alongside each other. We often study them separately from each other, although the evidence is clear that they did not live that way, and such encounters merit greater analysis. When thinking through the disparate systems of slavery in the early modern world, scholars occasionally distinguish slavery from captivity. Slavery is, of course, the buying and selling of the human being as property in ways that erase their humanity. It was generally lifelong and intergenerational. Captivity, associated with Mediterranean slavery, is viewed as a model of unfreedom that is both reciprocal and temporary. North African corsairs enslaved people from ships and coastal regions of Europe, while Southern European corsairs engaged in similar practices and ransomed each other's captives. This created an economy of ransoming, a state of captivity with the promise of release and repatriation. The potential for ransom and return is a stark distinction between the two models and make them appear parallel systems without intersection. Yet we know that the majority of Europeans and North Africans enslaved as part of the Mediterranean warfare were not in fact ransomed, and fewer still escaped. Comparative rates of emancipation between enslaved North African people and enslaved blacks within Spain are not well studied, although we know that Spaniards viewed Black African and Muslim North African people in very different ways, even in cases of the status of enslaved. Captivity, then, was a concept employed by early modern Spaniards, but it could also be used interchangeably with slave, and even when distinct terms were employed, such distinctions could mask greater similarities between the two. But this distinction also permitted Spanish authors to create complex ideological arguments by the ways they deployed the terms, especially captivity. In this article, I analyze several examples of Spanish clerics, one a hagiographer and one the author of a sermon, writing accounts of the lives of two Black women, both kidnapped as children from West Africa, whose status of Black slaves was described in similar ways to white Spaniards captured by Muslim pirates. The discursive work of comparing Black holy women to Spanish sailors offers a window into the complexities of Spanish thinking about the Atlantic Mediterranean and the ways they articulated racial and religious difference in a multi-ethnic society. While Black Africans were frequently described as savage, ugly, deformed, and incapable of reason, North African and Ottomans were viewed as malevolent, but they were largely white and maintained markers of civilization as defined by early modern Spaniards. And yet white Spaniards found Black Africans allies against Islamic enemies, thereby offering, at least in theory, spiritual kinship. But this alliance, in turn, was likely only possible because the Spanish maintained the dominant position of enslaver and never the enslaved in the Atlantic model. It was a gesture that could be offered as a form of magnanimity or largesse without any potential as being seen a weakness. Seen in this light, it is clear the Spanish authors discussed in this article are engaged in an intense intellectual and theological project aimed at undergirding and justifying both slave trades simultaneously. Another example, an early example, where we see what I call the triangle between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, articulated most clearly, is in Lope de Vega's famous Comedia de Santos, El Santo Negro de Rosambuco, that appeared in the beginning of the 17th century. It is often associated, El Santo Negro, with San Benito de Palermo, but there is reason to question this identification. The play opens with the end of a fierce battle in which Spanish forces have triumphed over North African corsairs. Rosambuco, the leader of the defeated Muslims, despairs at his defeat and attempted suicide by throwing himself into the sea, from which he was saved by an apparition of a child, presumably Christ, who assures Rosambuco that God is watching over him. Rosambuco then encounters the leader of the Spanish military, Don Pedro. The defeated captain explains to Don Pedro that he was a Muslim corsair, born in Ethiopia, but captured by Ottoman forces as a child, enslaved and converted to Islam. His next conversion to Christianity stemmed from witnessing a miracle performed by Francis of Assisi, after which Rosambuco decides to change his name to Benito and enter a Franciscan convent. The rest of his plot centers on his life in this convent, where he has to contend with the bitter resentment of a fellow friar who attempts to murder Benito in the third act. The saint's double origin as Ethiopian and Muslim, taken in captivity twice in order to be redeemed by God, reveals the way in which Lope and his audience thought about enslavement, captivity, race, and conversion. This first Spanish play about a black saint has this specific Atlantic Mediterranean origin story, even though it is not in fact the story of the real San Benito de Palermo. The privileging of black Africans over North Africans as allies to white Spaniards represents a departure from most depictions of black enslaved and free people in 17th century theater and poetry, which allows us to see more clearly how it is primarily through the lens of North African Islam that enables black Africans to be elevated by white authors. Many managed as redeemable, as the ones who can be saved, in contrast to Islamic slaves. Many Mediterranean scholars have identified the Battle of Lepanto as something of a transition moment for the political and naval dynamics of the sea, which ultimately led to the precipitous rise of North African city-states and the engagement of corsairing on both sides of the strait. The numbers of captains taken, both Spanish and North African, fluctuated throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, reaching a zenith in the latter part of the 17th century. The sharp drop of this trade at the beginning of the 18th century, and then another precipitous drop at the end of the century, a rhythm that followed political, economic, and diplomatic shifts. Large numbers of Spaniards held captive in North African cities changed the dynamics of the triangle as they first evolved in previous centuries, as the specter of white captivity loomed large on the Spanish imagination. As part of the response to the increased specter of enslavement on the Mediterranean, medieval military orders, referred to as redemption societies, the Mercedarians and Trinitarians, gained new prominence. The Mercedarians' order's main purpose was to redeem captives who had been enslaved by Islamic corsairs on the Mediterranean. But their translation to the Americas, so all the religious orders end up taking presence in the Americas, could change their orientation. While we know that the redemption orders could raise money for Mediterranean captives in the Americas, Mercedarians in the Americas also hosted black confraternities in some American cities, including Mexico City and Brazil, where there was an explicit connection made between the redemption, the powers of Our Lady of Mercy in particular, and the earthly liberation of enslaved Africans. So we see this sort of shift happening based on geography. So I just want to show some images you might be familiar with of the Mercedarians, and this is a very famous late medieval image of the redemption of enslaved people, and then we have Our Lady of Mercy also with the enslaved people at her feet. Another one, and you can see here, the Our Lady of Mercy is holding the chains of the enslaved. So these are almost always images of exchange, which is another interesting feature of thinking about the exchange factor of the ransom economy of the Mediterranean. In 1735, however, one Mercedarian in Seville, Pedro de Contreras, preached a sermon in honor of a black former slave who died in the odor of sanctity, Magdalena de la Cruz. Magdalena had been enslaved in Cabo Verde, brought to Cadiz, and then to Sevilla at the age of 8 or 9. In his funeral sermon, Contreras employed the biblical allegory of Deborah, Rebecca's nurse from Genesis, who appears briefly in the cycle about Jacob and his family. Deborah, the faithful servant, is buried under a terebinth tree, which is sometimes translated as oak, which was thereafter called the tree of weeping, which Contreras claimed emitted mercy. Deborah here stands for Magdalena, the faithful servant, buried under the protection of Our Lady of Mercy, the patroness of the Mercedarian order. Later in the sermon, Contreras claimed that Magdalena had been deeply devoted to Our Lady of Mercy because of the Virgin's patronage over misery, captives, and slaves. Contreras described Magdalena as particularly devoted as the Redemptora de Captivos. Facing tribulations, Magdalena experienced an apparition of Our Lady of Mercy, who ordered Magdalena to wear her holy scapulary, which would defend her in battles, and to receive a carta de esclavitud to the Virgin. Here the Virgin promises Magdalena protection if the Holy Woman puts herself under the Virgin's particular patronage. Magdalena thus converts into the Virgin's slave, exchanging the perils of terrestrial freedom for divine chains. And this is a story we see often with enslaved holy women, where they are given terrestrial freedom and then exchange it back for the spiritual enslavement to one of the saints or the Virgin. In Contreras' declaration of Magdalena's devotion to Our Lady of Mercy, however, we see the Virgin protecting the enslaved. It is an interesting turn because it emphasizes Magdalena's misery, while would she require particular mercy, while Magdalena's enslavers are depicted as loving and kind, rather than oppressive. In a sleight of hand that connects Magdalena with a Mercedarian patron, Magdalena is transformed into a captive rather than a slave, redeemed by her enslavement because it brought her to Spain and to Christianity. The Mercedarians then can claim her as their own. It is unclear how Contreras came to be connected to Magdalena or why he was chosen to perform her funeral sermon. The authors of one of the approbations of the sermon explain that the Mercedarians felt particular sorrow upon her death, quote, because they were the closest and had examined the characteristics and admired her perfection and virtue. The Mercedarians were not associated with conversion or missionary work in the ways of the Jesuits or Franciscans were. Perhaps not surprising then, Contreras does not claim credit for Magdalena's transformation from pagan to Christian, only the mechanism through which her captivity facilitated her Christianity. We see then a Mediterranean sensibility adapted to fit an Atlantic model of slavery. The process of turning Magdalena into a captive redeemed through her slavery as opposed to from her slavery doubly objectifies her. Of course, as a slave, her personhood is put into a doubt, if not outright denied, but her state of being is fraught and ambivalent. She is enslaved and free because she is enslaved to Christ and the Virgin, rather than to pagan gods, and later to worldly concerns, unstated but including any desire for freedom from racism. Magdalena is both then object her body, and a person, her soul. On a spiritual level, Catholics recognize the power of her body as a vessel for the soul and path to experiencing divine gifts as well as punishments. The pain endured by the body could act as redemption force, an echo of Christ's suffering, an offering of redemption to all people. It worked in a dynamic bond with the soul, not in opposition to it. Similar dynamics held true in medieval and early modern Catholic approaches to holy objects, particularly relics and sacred images. The relationship between the body and the divine is most evident in the case of relics, which were, of course, the bodies of the saints themselves, and which continued to channel divine gifts millennia after the saint herself did. A bone was still a body, and a body acted as a conduit for the holy. The same could hold true for the host, or an image, whether painting or sculpture. Such objects were not bodies, of course, but their very materiality permitted them to act as conduits in the same way as relics. They performed miracles and punished the unworthy, and they expressed bodily fluid, such as tears or blood or milk, and they experienced suffering when mistreated. When we think about the role that the Mercedarians and Trinitarians played in the redemption of sacred objects alongside human beings, it is crucial to remember not only the spiritual priorities of religious orders, but Catholic understandings of such objects as in some ways embodied, as requiring protection. More protection than humans in some ways, meaning sacred objects had more direct contact with the divine than a person. Throughout the early modern period, concern over the fate of sacred images in the hands of heretics and idolaters led to wide-scale efforts, most famously by Felipe II, to acquire as many relics as possible from Protestant lands to protect them from iconoclasts. Similar efforts were to rescue sacred images that fell into the hands of North African corsairs, from which they also faced potential defacement and destruction. Mercedarian and Trinitarian attempts to rescue holy images from North Africa were cast as redemptions in a similar vein to the redemptions of individuals. The images were captives, subject to brutality and violence at the hands of God's enemy, and their safe return was of great importance to the orders and Spanish more generally, and such rescues were sometimes celebrated with large festivals, as we saw in the example of the Jesus Nazareno at the very beginning. This image is a key to this study because of one account of its rescue that surfaced in the life of Teresa Juliana. It takes a prominent place in the narrative of Teresa's early spiritual experience, and like Contreras' sermon, collapses the Atlantic and Mediterranean slavery. And I just want to show really quickly. This is an image of the image being abused by North African Muslims prior to its redemption. And these types of images were promulgated in Spain to help the Trinitarians and the Mercedarians raise money to redeem these images. We're sometimes surprised to learn they have lists of people that they redeemed, but also objects, and this is very important to them, that they would spend their money that they raised, sometimes not on people, but on sacred images. There are different accounts about the construction of the sculpture, but it was most likely crafted in Sevilla, commissioned by Capuchin friars. The life-size polychrome sculpture represents Christ in the Passion cycle, as we've discussed. Jesus was taken to the Capuchin convent in the Spanish Presidio of Marmara in North Africa, present-day Morocco. Though the political dynamics in Morocco changed soon after, and the Presidio was taken by the Sultan, people enslaved and the churches plundered for their valuable goods and images. One account of the fall of the city included a list of images taken by Morocco forces, including the Jesus, a Christ crucified, Joseph holding the Christ child, Michael the Archangel, St. Lucy, St. Anthony of Padua, St. Francis of Assisi, and several images of the Virgin Mary. It further describes the mutilation of several images, one of which, quote, lacks the right hand due to the insults and blows from the moros, while one of the images of the Virgin Mary had lost her pedestal for the same reason. The Jesus Nazareno, like several of the other images, appears to have survived intact, with its purple tunic, hands tied in front, and gold silk rope around its neck. Several other accounts of the events in Baltimore also lamented the theft and mistreatment of the images. Quote, the sacrilegious actions committed by the perfidious Mohammedans to the holy images. Rafael de San Juan's short account of the redemptions achieved by the Trinitarians weaves together people with images. For 1682, the friar mentions how Friar Miguel de Jesus Maria, Juan de la Visitación, and Martín de la Resurrección redeemed 17 sacred images. The sacrilegious actions taken by Moroccan soldiers against sculptures included dragging and whipping, in addition to cutting off limbs. Rafael de San Juan recounted, quote, having taken control of the holy images, they began to insult and ridicule them, carrying them as spoils of triumph into the city of Mequinas, planting them before the king, Muli Ismail. He ordered them dragged through the streets out of hatred of the Christian religion, and afterwards had them chased by lions as though they were human flesh, so that they would be torn to shreds. Discalced Trinitarian Pedro de los Angeles was so distressed by the sight that he begged the king to accept the ransom to save them. This passage is particularly illuminating and speaks to the point above about the thingness of sacred images inhabiting a liminal space between the divine and flesh. The images is not only dragged and insulted, but the detail about them being torn apart by lions is particularly vivid because it echoes accounts of early Christian martyrdoms at the hands of Roman authorities who often had such Christians torn apart by wild animals in the arena as a method of execution and for the entertainment of the audience. Here, the sculpture transformed into martyrs as though they had human flesh. Here, once redeemed by the Trinitarians, the Jesus Nazareno made its way to Seville and then Madrid, as we've discussed. It is unclear why this particular image of all of the ones redeemed became so important, although the dedication in Rafael de San Juan's work provides a clue. It begins, quote, to whom, sir, ought this book on the redemption of captives be dedicated except he who is the true Redeemer of the world? In this account, the Redeemer of the world is redeemed by the faithful, an act of devotion and loyalty to the one who redeemed them all, a sensibility that is intensified by the fact that the image is one that depicts Christ during his passion. Hanging over these words is the reality that enslaved Christians in North Africa sometimes converted to Islam as a way of escaping their enslavement, since converted slaves were often manumitted by their enslavers. One captivity narrative that described the experience of Galan states clearly in the first chapter that God provided him particular strength to, quote, not abandon the Catholic faith as infinite Christians had done. It freed me from the tall into such blind abyss that so many baptized were mired by that evil sect. Those who did not abandon their faith remained steadfast, suffering for their God, and which could in turn be described as experienced martyrdom. The Jesus Nazareno was not the only ecce homo to which the child Teresa Juliana expressed devotion in the Marquis de Mancera's household. Teresa would find refuge in the Marques's chapel in front of an image of the ecce homo to whom she poured out of her frustrations and miseries. We do not know if this image was a painting or a small sculpture, but it was more likely a painting. In these moments with the image, Jesus communicated both his compassion and his desire to Teresa, his desire for her to endure her suffering in silence for his sake, while simultaneously being consoled by him. A poem that was written by a Spanish poet based on Paniagua's hagiographer Teresa made the parallel even clearer, claiming, quote, they came together in union, the ecce homo and the ecce mulier. They shared the experience of bodily suffering, uniting Christ with Teresa, binding them together. Soon after this communion, Teresa faces a new series of threats to her well-being, even her life. While her first enemy in the Mancera household was the woman in charge of her, the devil plagued her through a series of attempts on her life, including throwing her into the lake in the Buen Retiro Park, from which she was miraculously saved. The devil next persuaded another of Mancera's slaves, a young Turkish woman, to turn against Teresa. Although they were both enslaved, Paniagua points out that the Turkish woman, unnamed, was both white and pretty, yet envious of Teresa's closer relationship to the Manceras. Repeated failures in divine intervention led to a collapse of the Turkish women's efforts to kill Teresa and a withdrawal of the demonic influence on her. Here we see the stock character of the evil Turk, subject to diabolical influence, with no true goal except to act as God's chosen. Although white and lovely, the Turkish woman is sunk in evil, connected implicitly to her Muslim identity, waging war against the true faith in the figure of the black young woman. Immediately after the Turkish woman's restoration to calm, the two grow close because they were both enslaved and far from home. This swift and strange development not only underscores Teresa's forgiving nature, but sets the stage for the next event, the Turkish woman's conversion to Christianity, which Teresa persuaded her into accepting. Well, for Paniagua, the centerpiece of the story is Teresa's ability to bring the gospel to unbeliever, a black Christian bringing salvation to a Muslim one, is itself a striking suggestion. He also subtly layers the groundwork for a later anecdote in which one of Teresa's relatives from Guinea arrive suddenly to propose to her and try to convince her to return to their homeland. She refuses. The longing for home, a site of false religion, acts as temptation, and Teresa resists, secures her place in the convent, and dies in the odor of sanctity. The next chapter introduces the Jesus Nazareno as part of a series of stories of marvels on Teresa's piety. Paniagua explains that a Discalced Trinitarian had recently rescued the image of Christ, so he tells the whole story of its suffering by the Moors, and that the image experienced the same pains that the most sacred body of our Redeemer suffering. So Teresa did not receive one of the copies of the print. Here we'll go just back to the copy of the print. She had been prevented from attending the procession and also in receiving a copy. Soon thereafter, however, she miraculously discovered one of the engravings in a coffer they were emptying, which Paniagua assures the reader could not have been placed there by any human hand, since it had been locked up tightly. She recognized the miraculous nature of the gift, reflecting that it was, quote, a reward for her humble suffering. While the events discussed in the hagiography occurred in 1682 Madrid, the hagiography was not written until 1752 and printed in Salamanca, where both the author and the tertiary lived. The chronological and geographic distance between the two might help explain how vague Paniagua's account of the Jesus Nazareno's rescue was. It was an extraordinarily famous image, and its cult spread to many sites throughout Spain, but it is not in and of itself of particular interest to Paniagua. It is actually difficult to identify the Jesus Nazareno from Paniagua's account without the addition of the date, which confirms its identity. His interest was the connection between the two and Teresa's spiritual gifts. The tie between the image and slave derived from what Paniagua argues is their joint experience of being rescued from paganism and delivered to Christian salvation. The juxtaposition suggests that Teresa's true home was Christendom, while her native land was in fact the foreign place of captivity, which is part of the reason that the idea of returning to her homeland is presented as a temptation rather than a gift. It is a strange and complex mashup of events. On one hand, Teresa and the image of Christ are described as being brutally mistreated by North African Muslims. In this instance, the dangers of damnation from her pagan upbringing were not a central focus for a moral diatribe on Paniagua's part. So while Teresa might be read as having been a spiritual captive in pagan Africa, just as the image, redeemed and brought back to her true Enemies. The juxtaposition is heightened by how careful he was in describing her family in West Africa. The brutal slave trade that stole Teresa from her family and brought her to Spain at enormous profit is nothing compared to the perfidious greed of the North African pirates who kidnapped and ransomed a sacred image. The tension here is acute. Spain's deep involvement in the slave trade and significant economic gain from slave labor were not hidden in the colonies, but persisted. For the Iberian clergy to bring an individual to Christendom to be baptized and granted access to grace and salvation was a precious gift, not a theft. Any suffering incurred along the way was part of the divine path to redemption, and all early modern Catholics knew that the more one suffered, the holier one was, as long as one suffered willingly. In a parallel fashion, any seizures by North Africans from Christendom, whether in sacred or act or people, were viewed as intrinsically illegitimate, based in greed rather than spiritual privileges. The purpose of these rhetorical gymnastics is to provide a coherent framework to argue for the sanctity of a West African tertiary in mid-18th century Salamanca. The anti-slavery arguments, beginning in perhaps with Tomás de Mercado in the 16th century, centered on perpetual slavery rather than the institution of slavery qua slavery. More, calls for the end of the brutality of the slave trade proliferated throughout the 18th century Atlantic world. Such calls were framed in terms of both canon and natural law and directly undermined older justifications of just war. In 1735 and 1749, when the works on Magdalena de la Cruz and Teresa Juliana de Santo Domingo were printed, the transatlantic slave trade was at its zenith in the Americas, though increasingly marginal within Spain itself. The accounts of the two black women provided theological justification for continued Spanish slaving in West and Central Africa, impressing upon readers the divine glories that could result from enslavement and conversion. As captains to be redeemed, Magdalena and Teresa were rescued by Spanish authorities. By applying, even in a somewhat tortured fashion, the Mediterranean model of slavery, Spanish clergy collapsed black bodies and sacred images as hostage to Christian enemies whose remove to Spain offered healing and release. Their lavish praise of Magdalena and Teresa deployed Mediterranean captivity as a way of defending and explaining the West African slave trade within Spain. Moreover, the integration of black slaves into Spanish Christian society provided an opportunity to celebrate the taking of North African and Turkish slaves, not for redemption, but for lifelong forced labor. The contrast with black saints reinforced the idea that North African and Turkish slaves, most of whom remain Muslim, continued to be enemies of Christendom and therefore equally deserving of their enslavement. So I just have one last image. That's the end of the paper, and I wanted to just show. This is Teresa Juliana de Santo Domingo in a fresco in Salamanca. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Rowe. I think we have room for questions, if you allow us.
Yes, of course.
Who wants to start? Questions? Please, Victor.
I have a question. It might be silly, or maybe I didn't understand correctly, maybe. But if I understand, they separated between captivity and slavery. Well, the Spanish did that separation. Did it ever occur an overlap in that they used both terms at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
Because in this instance, what could that, in which instance was it, and what could it be?
Yes, so I realized when I was started this paper that they do make the distinction in the terms, but they also use them sometimes indiscriminately. Like there doesn't always seem to be a reason why they choose one term or the other. So I thought, okay, well, this is I'm making a distinction for rhetorical effect. They do sometimes use those different terms, but not always. I thought it was a useful framework to help us understand the different modes of thinking, but there doesn't seem to be any reason when they kind of collapse them.
In a single.
Yeah.
I asked because
Yeah.
I've seen this, but in Portuguese. documents.
The distinction.
No, not the distinction.
Yeah,
the conjunction.
Yes.
They
Yes.
refer to them as slave captives.
Yes.
So,
Yes, it's interesting though because we often see it in the scholarship on Mediterranean slavery, the use of the word captive very often as the dominant word, and sometimes they might refer to the people as slaves, but that we talk about the Mediterranean slave trade as captivity usually, which I think has some usefulness, but is also not correct at the same time.
More questions? Pedro, please.
And thank you so much, Professor, for the presentation. I have a question about the celebrations that the Spanish or the other Catholics used to make when the immigrants return, or redeem, as you said. In those celebrations, did they, by any chance, evoke the image of Christ redeeming the people?
Mm-hmm.
So the Spanish, they not became Christ, but like in the sense they redeemed the image like Christ redeemed the people.
Yes, yes, and they use that language all the time. And that's one of the things that I like about the concept of redemption of people, because they're clearly always playing on the term of redemption. So yes, they don't usually refer to themselves as being Christ-like. It's sort of like he redeemed us, so we owe him redemption. They're making kind of a circle, but yes, they make that connection all the time.
More questions? I would like to ask you also three questions. Well, first, in your opinion, what was the intention of the clerics that wrote this kind of reports, these histories about these experiences of the redemption of slaves, images, captives? It was a matter of the literature of the edification, conversion, reflection on slavery, and captivity, were they concerned about this, or simply propaganda of the respective religious orders? The second, and also related to the sources you used, you found any reports made by Teresa Juliana herself about her own personal experience of being rescued in Africa and then her conversion? And third, it is related to the images you show us about the redemption of captives. In all the images, if I saw them well, you have representations of the Mother of Christ, of Mercedarians or Trinitarians, objects that refer to captivity, for instance, chains, but never the captives. If I notice well, only in the medieval sculpture representation you have the captives behind the most important scene. Why? How do you interpret this? Why were not they figured there?
The Trinitarians were a lot more likely to show the exchange, because that was the key piece of the first image that survives in Italy of the Trinitarian order is of captive exchange. So you almost always have the two figures. And in Italian images, for most of the period, early modern period, the figure is North African Muslim, but sometimes is a Black African, because in the original image it shows a white person and an Ethiopian person. So I think that maybe is the difference, is that for the Mercedarians, that Mary is the center, and it's less about the showing the captivity and more about her. That would be my guess. Yeah. I think all the accounts, whether they're the accounts of the objects being redeemed, or the two accounts of the lives of holy women. I think there is always an element of propaganda, and not in the sense of misinformation, but in the sense of they're making an argument, they're trying to convince their audience of something, and they're usually trying to convince their audience of several things at the same time. I think they get into, they don't know how to explain the relationship between slavery and holiness in these stories of these enslaved women, because they need to emphasize the way that the women suffered, but they also can't say that slavery is bad. So in both of these accounts, for Teresa and for Magdalena, the owners are all kind. So it has to be other people that are causing the suffering, or sort of vaguely the status of being a slave, but not really. And I think one of the reasons why the Mercedarian example with Magdalena is potentially subversive is that we don't want, in the Spanish slaving system, you don't want a saint that is dedicated to manumitting slaves in a system where you don't want slaves to be manumitted. And that's one of the things that's interesting about the Mercedarians hosting Black confraternities in the Americas, because Black confraternities frequently did raise money to manumit enslaved people. But Contreras clearly is not interested in that argument. He does not want it to be that subversive, so he has to sort of constantly being like, oh, this is why it's okay to have slaves, even though she, shouldn't be enslaved, but it's okay. He's really trying to figure it out, and that's one of the reasons why I find this so interesting, is that they're kind of confronted with the tension in their own ideology, and he has to kind of work it out, and it's kind of, there's a lot of what we call in English mental gymnastics happening there. As for Teresa Juliana, that's a great question, because she was literate, and there are,
She was literate.
She was.
She learned when she came
Yes. Yes, probably, I don't know if it was in Madrid or in Salamanca, I don't know. But there's a really excellent edition of Paniagua's Vida of Teresa Juliana that was edited. You can get a printed copy in Spanish, of course, online, but it was translated into English by this scholar Baltasar Fra Molinero. And this is a really great edition because he did some archival work and found some more material that was by her, not just the hagiography. But inside the hagiography itself, he has these, they read like excerpts where he's sort of like quotation marks and then it's in italics. And that's clearly supposed to represent her voice, and it is different. The voice is different than his regular voice, and he did know her in life and was her confessor, so they clearly had conversations, and so it suggests that at least some of that is reflective, and there's more of that in the early parts where she's talking about her life, what she remembers before her kidnapping, what happens on the ship, and then as she gets older, that kind of disappears, which is interesting too.
Any more questions? Jean, please.
Do you know other images or paintings from other religious orders with semi-propos?
Like this one? Well, there is another one of Teresa inside the convent itself, but I don't know of any others of sort of what we call living saints in Spain. There are some in the Americas, particularly in Lima, but also in Puebla, in Mexico. But they were not very well. I say we don't have any, but we actually don't know, right? Because and this is particularly true in Latin America, where it's more common for the convents to be active. Unlike in Spain and Portugal, where most were dismantled, where you sometimes have a kind of a live-in convent, but usually it's a museum. And then you can kind of see the objects more. But in Latin America, you have a lot more and actually in Spain even more than Portugal. So you can't get inside, so you don't always know what's there. So I'm always a little careful about saying, oh, there wasn't any, because we actually don't know. And that was true, particularly of Porcelana de Jesus in Lima, where nobody knew anything about her until outside the convent, until this American scholar got access, and there were 2 images of her, as well as a manuscript hagiography and her own spiritual autobiography. So there was a huge amount of material about her, but nobody knew anything about it because it was lock and key.
Any more questions? Please, Diogo.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really, really, really good to hear. I have one question. Here in Portugal, I'm trying to figure out some sacred image that were also rescued by the Trinitary order in Portugal. And we had this Portuguese Trinitary chronicler that in the 18th century describes some sacred image that were rescued, if we can use that term in this context. And my question is really a direct one. Do you know any case for Portuguese, in the Portuguese case of rescue sacred image?
Diogo is an art historian.
Yes. I don't know, and that's not because there isn't any, but I haven't, this is a case where I haven't looked at the Portuguese sources for the rescued images. I'm hoping in the next stage of this project I'll spend a little more time on Portugal, but there's a lot of research that you might be familiar with in the by Spanish art historians about, because they were both harmed through coastal raids as well as these kind of rescuings. But I wasn't sure if the similar dynamics happened in Portugal, so that's good to know.
And it's really expressed the way that the chroniclers describe the narrative is really similar to the one that you have described. So I was hearing all of that, and I was really impressed because the narrative and the way that he's expressed is really similar, and of course it's the same order, and it was really interesting to know, and I'm trying to find some of this image, and so I have to ask.
Yes, yeah, no, it's a great question, and it would be fabulous to find any or festivals that celebrated them. I mean, we're very lucky in this case because the image is so famous in Spain, and there are a couple that are just not as many as the objects that were rescued, but some of them are still famous. There's actually one in Mexico City of a Jesus Niño that is really famous, but he's now the patron saint of kidnap victims in Mexico City. So I don't get kidnapped in Mexico, but if you do, he's the saint to pray to. Yeah, no, it's a fascinating, I think, topic. Yeah.
And even the iconography associated to all of that, Our Lady of the Remedies for the Trinitaries, it's really interesting. I'm trying to find out this image that was in the Trinas convent, in one of the Trinas convent in Lisbon. And it was really associated to all of this. It's really difficult to find. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Trinas was the name that the Portuguese gave to the female Trinitarians.
Yes.
Trinas. Any more questions? Yes, Victor.
I've seen that Our Lady of Mercy is let's say, version of Mary that is most associated in the Spanish world. I understand to the devotion of the enslaved because of this association, or am I looking? Because I asked because the confraternities in America, I see because I'm from a city with a big historical black fraternity.
Which city?
Salvador.
Yeah.
And the version of the Mary Lady worship is of the Rose version.
Yes.
And I wanted to know if this type of phenomenon, of course, that's the same in the Spanish world, because that's I have less. I know less about it, about the black confraternities in Spanish world.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. So it is the rosary version is absolutely the one most commonly associated with Black confraternities in Spain and Portugal, as well as throughout the Americas. That was the first one that accepted Black members, actually here in Portugal, and then but it was common in. Throughout the Spanish world also, for sure. And the Black confraternities in Brazil, I studied a little bit, and I didn't visit any of those churches, but there are magnificent images throughout them. And obviously the history of Black confraternities in Brazil is in some ways more important, but they still have a presence today in a way that it doesn't necessarily exist in other cities and towns. So the archaeological and art historical evidence there is extremely rich. Yes, it's the rosary. Mm-hmm. And I think for that reason, because they were the first ones in Lisbon that allowed Black members.
Yeah, since the beginning of the 16th century, the first one in Lisbon. Okay, anyone more? Please, Edgar.
Thank you, Professor Rowe, for sharing the latest results of your research with us. I would like to build on Gabriel's first question about the interchangeability of the term captive with enslaved person. Do you think that for like second half of the 16th century and 17th century and going forward, the interchangeability of this term, which is clear in the case of the Portuguese Atlantic, I don't know if that is so much the case for the Spanish Empire, do you think that this interchangeability comes from the simple fact that the word that kind of lost its original meaning and then just became a simple synonym for the term enslaved or person was commodified? Or does it bring to mind the idea that maybe for people who were buying enslaved people, participating in the enslavement or in the acquisition and embarkation of these people in Atlantic Africa, that this brings to mind that they weren't aware that the original reason for these people being in this state of enslavement was the fact that in many cases they had been war prisoners. So my question in essence is, were they aware of the situations and the processes that these people had gone through before, up to the point that they finally were captive and in their possession and they were being transacted across the Middle Passage?
That's a really, really good question. So I'm not a specialist in the ports of origin in West and Central Africa for enslaved people. We do have evidence that they certainly did know to a certain extent that, and I think that was the case. I can't believe I can't remember the case of Teresa Pugliana, right? Was kidnapped by her. She was a member of the royal family, kidnapped by enemies, and then sold over to the Spanish. So I think, but whether or not that feels like it has its own kind of doubleness, like they understood that happened sometimes, but it was also another great form of justification. We didn't enslave them exactly, even though they knew in many cases that they did. At least I see in Spanish less often the conflation of those two terms in transatlantic slavery, and more often the conflation in the Mediterranean. It's not that it never happens that somebody enslaved in the Americas is referred to as a captive, but it's much, much less common.
Okay. Thank you.
Any last question? No? Everybody's satisfied? So, Professor Rowe, thank you very much once more for coming. It was a pleasure having you here, and we will stay in touch.
Yes.
Thank you.